The Young and the Restless spoilers. Lily had always known that love could lie, but she had never understood just how easily lies could wear the mask of love until Kane Ashby came into her life. He had been her salvation once, the man who promised to protect her from the chaos of Genoa City, the man who swore that his devotion was pure. But in the quiet spaces between their words, in the subtle changes in his eyes, in the way his voice hardened whenever she mentioned Damien, Lily began to sense that her safety was built on sand. For months, she had told herself that suspicion was poison, that she needed to trust, to forgive, to rebuild. Yet no matter how much she tried to silence her intuition, it kept whispering the same message: Kane was hiding something terrible. It wasn't just another business secret, or another manipulative partnership, it was something darker, something that made her stomach twist whenever she thought about it too long. She had loved Damien once, deeply, recklessly, the kind of love that threatened to tear her away from everything familiar. He had been gentle where Kane was sharp, honest where Kane was evasive. When Damien died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, Lily's world shattered. She buried her grief behind routines, charity events, and the polished smile of a woman who refused to break. But she had always known. The police report said it was an accident, but her heart refused to believe it. And when she noticed Kane flinch each time Damien's name was mentioned, when she saw the faint tremor in his hands as he read the news of the death, she knew there was more. She didn't say it aloud, not then. She played her part perfectly, the devoted wife, the quiet supporter, the woman who trusted her husband implicitly. But inside, she was already building a plan. Kane had underestimated her. He thought her love made her blind, but in truth, it made her patient. She knew the kind of man he was: intelligent, strategic, meticulous. He would never leave evidence out in the open. If she wanted to find the truth, she had to become him: careful, methodical, deceptive. So she watched. She took mental notes of when he left the house, when he turned off his computer, when his phone vibrated and he rushed to take calls in private. She studied him like an investigator studies a suspect, masking her curiosity behind a smile. Slowly, patterns emerged. Certain names appeared in his calendar repeatedly. Meetings that were never discussed afterward. Locked drawers that were opened late at night and closed before dawn. And always, his refusal to let anyone touch the old mahogany desk in his study. That desk had become a symbol, the barrier between truth and her sanity. Lily's heart grew colder as the weeks went by. Her love for him didn't vanish, it transformed into something quieter, harder, edged with resolve. She had spent too many years watching powerful men manipulate the narrative: Victor, Adam, Jack, and now Kane. She had learned from them all. But unlike them, she didn't seek power for its own sake. She sought justice. She needed to look into his eyes one day and know that she wasn't crazy, that the darkness she felt pulsing beneath their life together was real. When the opportunity came, it was almost cruel in its simplicity. It was a clear morning, sunlight spilling through the windows, the kind of day that looked too perfect to hold secrets. Kane had an important meeting with Victor Newman at the ranch, something about a new joint investment meant to stabilize his image after months of controversy. He left early, dressed sharply, full of confidence. He kissed her goodbye as if nothing in the world could go wrong. That was his mistake. The moment she heard the car leave the driveway, Lily's mask dropped. Her hands trembled slightly as she walked into his office. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and for a second, she felt the weight of her own betrayal. But then she remembered Damien, his smile, his warmth, the way his life had been stolen from him, and her hesitation vanished. The desk resisted her at first. Kane had installed a digital lock system years ago, but Lily had learned his habits too well. He used the same numbers for everything, his birth year combined with hers, a pathetic attempt at sentimentality masquerading as security. The drawer clicked open, and for a heartbeat, she almost wished it hadn't. Inside was a folder, thick, worn at the edges, labeled only with a single word: Ashfield. The name meant nothing at first, but as she flipped through the documents, her world began to tilt. Financial transfers, offshore accounts, encrypted emails, all leading to the same shell company that had been linked to Damien's death. Her breath caught when she saw it, a payment order dated 2 days before the accident, signed with Kane's authorization code. The paper slipped from her hand, fluttering to the floor like a dying leaf. She sank into the chair, tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned the page again, and there it was, a report from a private investigator, detailing movements, phone records, surveillance photos. Damien's final hours had been tracked, documented, and orchestrated. It wasn't random. It wasn't an accident. It was an execution. For a long time, Lily couldn't move. Her body felt weightless, detached, as if she were floating above her own life. The man she had trusted, forgiven, defended, the man who had shared her bed, her dreams, her laughter, had ordered the death of the only person who had ever truly loved her selflessly. And all this time, he had looked her in the eyes and spoken of redemption, of rebuilding trust, of second chances. The cruelty of it hollowed her out from the inside. But even through the pain, a strange calmness settled over her. This was what she had wanted, the truth. It had cost her everything, but it was hers now. She could finally stop pretending. The tears came slowly then, not loud, not hysterical, but silent and heavy, as if each one carried a memory that no longer belonged to her. She looked around the office, at the family photos on the shelves, at the life she had built on lies, and felt a mixture of sorrow and clarity. When Kane returned later that afternoon, he walked through the door oblivious, humming softly, carrying the confidence of a man who believed the world still bent to his will. He had no idea that his entire empire, both professional and personal, was already collapsing. The moment he entered his office, he knew something had changed. The air was different. The drawer was open. And Lily was standing by the window, her eyes red but her posture unbroken. He froze. For the first time in his life, Kane didn't know what to say. All his calculated words, all his strategic charm, abandoned him. He saw the folder in her hands and knew it was over. Everything he had buried so deeply had finally clawed its way to the surface. Lily didn't scream. She didn't throw accusations or demand explanations. She just looked at him, a long, hollow gaze that said everything words never could. In that silence, Kane saw himself reflected not as the man he wanted to be, but as the man he truly was. The architect of his own destruction. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but the moment his lips parted, Lily shook her head slowly, her eyes glistening. The gesture silenced him more effectively than any words. Kane's mind raced. He thought of lies he could tell, ways he could reframe the story. He could claim it was business, that Damien had been part of something larger, that it had never been personal. But even as the thoughts formed, he knew they were meaningless. The woman in front of him was no longer his wife, she was his judge. And no explanation could absolve him of what he had done. As the evening light filtered through the curtains, Lily finally turned away. She left the folder on his desk, its contents spilling out like confessions. Kane remained where he stood, paralyzed by the weight of his own guilt. He thought about calling her back, about begging for forgiveness, but he knew better. Lily had already made her decision. Her calmness was his punishment. She would not destroy him with anger, she would destroy him with indifference. Outside, the sky darkened, and with it, the illusion of control that Kane had clung to for so long. His empire might survive, his projects might continue, but the one person who had ever truly believed in his redemption was gone. And as the shadows lengthened across the floor, he realized that in his quest for power and perfection, he had murdered not only Damien but also the last trace of goodness within himself. In Genoa City, secrets never stayed buried. And by the time the sun rose again, the whispers had already begun, whispers that would soon grow into storms. Lily's silence would not last forever, and when the truth finally reached the world outside those walls, Kane would face not just the wrath of the law, but the verdict of a woman who had once loved him more than life itself. Lily had reached the edge of what her heart could bear. The woman who once believed that love could redeem even the most broken soul now stood face to face with the truth of what Kane Ashby really was. In her trembling hands were the documents, files, and photographs that no longer hid behind coded folders or locked drawers. They were raw, undeniable evidence, proof that every nightmare she had suppressed was real. The papers whispered of blood and greed, of stolen lives and stolen fortunes. There were wire transfers tied to shell accounts in offshore banks, there were encrypted orders for the disappearance of Damien, and there were digital correspondences that placed Kane at the center of plots far darker than anyone in Genoa City could imagine. But it was one set of files that made her heart stop entirely, the surveillance logs connected to Colin, his own father. The timestamps matched the night Colin vanished. The security footage from the docks showed Kane's car, the same license plate, the same taillight crack she remembered from years ago. The transfer of assets that followed proved motive. It was not an accident, not an act of mercy. It was murder, deliberate and cold, committed by a man who once held her face in his hands and promised her that family meant everything. Her breath caught as she found Damien's file next, the man she had once loved, the man whose memory she had buried beneath guilt and silence. The details were chillingly precise: payments to a private contractor, deleted text threads, a photograph of Damien's car after the crash, and the payment marked Ashfield operation. She remembered the way Kane had insisted on handling the funeral arrangements himself, how he had spoken of closure, of moving on, as though grief were something to be scheduled and completed. Now she knew why. Damien had been the one person who saw through Kane's charm, the one person who threatened to reveal the truth about his illegal acquisitions and the laundering behind the Chancellor Division. Damien's death was not random fate, it was a necessity in Kane's world. And when Lily read the final line, the confirmation of payment to the assassin, her tears blurred the ink into black rivers across the page. But then came the document that shattered her completely. It detailed the assault on Nick, the mysterious hit-and-run that left him hospitalized months earlier. The metadata connected to a vehicle rental under an alias Kane had used for years. The damage report described the same make and model Kane kept in his private garage. Even the timestamp matched the night of the incident. Lily felt sick as she realized that Kane's web extended beyond greed. It touched every life around her, every person who had ever trusted him. It was not ambition anymore, it was pathology. And still, the horrors were not over. The last folder contained references to the most recent scandal in town, the kidnapping of Noah Newman. Police reports had gone nowhere, no suspect had been named. But in Kane's private notes, there were references to leverage, containment, and collateral. There were emails between anonymous contacts discussing keeping the boy safe until the Newman pressure dies down. She couldn't tell if Kane had orchestrated it or if he had merely financed it, but the implication was enough to turn her blood cold. If he had been involved, even peripherally, then Noah's suffering, Sharon's tears, Nick's rage, had been nothing more than pawns in his endless game. Lily stared at the papers for a long time, her hands shaking, her breath shallow. Each page felt like a blade cutting through the last remnants of who she had been. The house was silent except for the pounding of her heart. When Kane finally returned, she didn't hesitate. She waited in the study, the evidence spread across the desk like a battlefield. He entered with his usual self-assured calm, but it vanished the instant he saw her face. Before he could speak, she threw the files toward him. The papers fluttered through the air, scattering like ash, landing at his feet. Her voice was gone, replaced by a fury that burned behind her eyes. Kane bent down, picked up the first page, and as he scanned the words, his shoulders slumped. The color drained from his face. He knew what she had found. He pressed his hands against his face, not to hide his tears, there were none, but to cover the shame that consumed him. All the lies, all the manipulations, all the control he had built collapsed into dust. The silence between them was unbearable. Lily's chest rose and fell as she tried to steady herself. She could hand everything to the police. Within hours, Kane would be in custody. The evidence was airtight: financial trails, digital records, physical proof. It would be enough to bury him for life. But justice, she realized, was not as simple as pressing charges. It was emotional, moral, spiritual. And she wasn't sure what kind of justice she truly wanted. She looked at him, the man she had once believed was her partner, her protector, her redemption, and saw nothing left but a stranger. Every moment they had shared, every word of affection, now felt like part of a con. Her mind screamed for vengeance. She wanted to destroy him the way he had destroyed everyone else. Yet her heart, fragile and traitorous, still ached for the man he had pretended to be. She remembered the nights he had held her when she cried for Damien, the mornings when he whispered promises of peace, the way he had touched her hand at every public event to reassure her that they were a team. Was any of it real? Or had she been loving a ghost all along? Cain remained silent, his head bowed. The shame in his posture was real, but Lily couldn't tell if it came from guilt or fear. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hollow, stripped of arrogance. He knew she could destroy him with a single call. He also knew she might not. Because for all her strength, Lily was still human, still capable of mercy, even toward monsters. As the minutes passed, she felt the conflict tear at her. The logical part of her wanted to gather every piece of paper, take it to Chance Chancellor, and let the law finish what she had started. But another part, the one that still remembered loving him, wanted to walk away, to let him rot in his own silence. Sending him to prison would end the story, but leaving him alive with the weight of his guilt would make him live it every day. It was a different kind of sentence, one that might hurt more than steel bars ever could. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she gathered the evidence into one pile. Her tears fell freely now, landing on the pages like drops of acid. She placed the folder back on the desk and turned to leave. Behind her, Cain whispered her name, but she didn't turn. His voice sounded small, broken, stripped of the confidence that had once defined him. For the first time, he sounded like a man who understood loss, true, irreversible loss. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint echo of her footsteps as she left the house. Inside, Cain sank to the floor beside the scattered papers, his breath ragged. He picked up one of the photographs, Damien's lifeless car, and felt the full force of what he had done crash over him. He thought of Colin, of greed, of every lie told to keep himself afloat, and realized that Lily's silence was not forgiveness. It was condemnation. She had spared him not out of mercy, but because she no longer considered him worth punishing. By nightfall, the mansion was dark. Cain sat alone in his office, surrounded by the evidence of his sins. The sound of Lily's car fading into the distance was the sound of his world ending. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the truth would eventually escape those walls. Genoa City had a way of uncovering every secret. Whether it came through Jill's discovery, Victor's curiosity, or Lily's final act of justice, it would not stay hidden forever. But for now, he was trapped in the most brutal prison of all, the one built from his own shame. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, Cain finally understood what Lily had known all along: every secret, no matter how deeply buried, eventually demands its price.